You're standing in Stoke Newington, a familiar street, shops, traffic, people moving through it. Some heading along the high street, others cutting across towards Church Street or Clissold Park. It feels like the kind of place where the surface tells you everything you need to know. And that's the problem, because places like this encourage you to read them only at the surface. You look at what's there, the buildings, the pavement, the ordinary pattern of daily life, and it feels complete, as if everything important is already visible. But for a moment, just try something slightly different. Instead of looking at the buildings, look at the road, the pavement, not as something you walk across, but as something with depth beneath it. There are sirens. It's night, not distant or abstract, but immediate, cutting through whatever you were doing. You don't know where the bombs will fall or how close they are. And in that moment, safety becomes paramount. It depends on where you are, what's near you, and what you can reach in time. So, imagine stepping off the road, off the pavement, not far at first, just enough to feel the change as the world above begins to recede. Then further, down into the ground beneath your feet, into London clay. The air changes, cooler, slightly heavier. The world above doesn't disappear all at once. It recedes in layers until what's left is enclosed. Air, walls, bodies, waiting. That particular sense of being underground with other people. And then the space opens out. Not a single room, not a shelter in the ordinary sense. A network, a system. And then we have to stop, because none of that exists. There's no entrance, no tunnel mouth, no visible trace on the surface, nothing you can point to and say, this is where it begins. But to understand that absence, we have to go back to the moment when protection was still being planned. Now, imagine this as home. It's late 1938, early 1939, not as an observer, but as someone who has to work out what happens when the siren goes. A terraced house, little or no garden, limited space, a dense layout that doesn't give you many options. And when you look at it like this, the problem with household protection starts to appear. This isn't theoretical. By 1938 and 1939, it's already being tested under bombing in Spain, in China. But here in Stoke Newington, this is the condition. A dense borough with streets and houses that don't give people many options. So, the question becomes simple. What do you expect from protection? Not in theory. Here, in this street, in this kind of house. Once you ask that properly, the problem shifts. Because the standard domestic solution, the Anderson shelter, depends on having somewhere to put it. A garden, some ground you can dig into, enough space behind the house, and a household able to install it, reach it, and use it when the siren goes. But in much of Stoke Newington, the assumption doesn't hold. Long terraces, narrow plots, very little open ground, often no garden. So what looks like a universal solution on paper isn't universal in practice. For a large part of the borough, protection can't really be solved at the level of the individual house. Not because people don't need protection, but because the house itself doesn't give them the space to make it work. No space, no garden, no way to make the Anderson shelter work. And this isn't just theoretical. By January 1940, 4 months after the war began, the borough reports that only one Anderson shelter has been sold, even allowing for the wider national system of free and subsidised shelters. That figure is still striking. 1. So if protection can't be delivered reliably at the level of the household, the problem changes scale. It becomes a street problem, a borough problem. And in Stoke Newington, that matters because the borough itself becomes the unit of protection. A question of how protection is distributed across the surface. And the official answer to that distribution problem was dispersal. Don't concentrate people in one place, spread the risk. Keep people near where they live, keep protection close, local, dispersed. And that has a certain logic. It's quicker, it's cheaper, it keeps people close to home, and it avoids for policymakers the frightening idea of moving whole populations underground. But close is not the same as safe. Near the house still means near the blast. Near the street still means within danger. And this is the official answer. Not a deep shelter system, not a tunnel network, a standard Home Office corrugated steel shelter issued as doctrine in early 1939. It's practical, distributed, domestic, but it's still built around an assumption about space, ground, and household life that doesn't fit everywhere. What's going on? Thank you. And that is exactly where Stoke Newington starts to become difficult for national policy. And behind the practical answer, there's another anxiety. One phrase keeps appearing in official thinking: shelter mentality. The fear was that if underground shelters became too secure, too organised, or too comfortable, people might not want to leave them. Not literally forever, but psychologically, socially, politically. Sir John Anderson was Lord Privy Seal, the minister responsible for air raid precautions before the war. So when he talks about underground protection, this isn't just a personal opinion, it's the language of government policy. For Anderson and Home Office officials, the shelter question was never only technical, it was behavioural. Would people use underground protection properly? Would they leave it? Would they keep working, moving, functioning? In December 1938, Anderson warned against creating what he called troglodyte existence. A troglodyte is a cave dweller, and that's the point. The fear was not simply that people might shelter underground. It was that underground protection might start to reshape their behaviour. How people moved, worked, waited, and expected to be protected. And yet, a few years later, this language comes back. Not as a warning now, but as a description of organised underground shelter life in London. The thing policy feared had, in places, happened anyway. People chose the protection they believed would keep them alive. So the argument against underground sheltering wasn't simply, can we build it? It was also, what happens if people prefer it? That is why this becomes a question of control. Control of movement, control of morale, control of what kinds of protection people were allowed to expect. But that raises the next question. Was deeper protection actually possible? Perhaps it wasn't being built because it couldn't be built. Perhaps the engineering wasn't there, or perhaps the resources weren't there. Those are serious questions. And the first answer is engineering capacity. London has been building underground railways for decades. And by the late 1930s, Britain was already building in reinforced concrete at scale, working with deep foundations and in constructing underground systems. So this is not a question of basic capability. But engineering capacity was only part of the answer. There was also lived evidence of what bombing did to cities. During the Spanish Civil War, Barcelona had already shown that bombing a city could mean, what bombing a city could mean. Streets, homes, ordinary civilian life. But it had also shown something else. Organised underground sheltering could become part of how a city survived. And this is why Barcelona matters here. It wasn't just a distant example. British engineers were studying it in real time. In January 1939, Cyril Helsby, a leading structural engineer, presented this paper to the Institution of Structural Engineers. His point was that Barcelona had made air raid protection a structural problem, not just a civil defence problem. He was looking at what bombing did to buildings, what kinds of protection survived, and how shelters had to work for people using them repeatedly. And Helsby would later serve as consulting engineer to the borough of Hackney during the war. So this evidence wasn't floating somewhere abstract. It was part of London's engineering conversation and part of the wider policy discussion around air raid protection, with direct relevance to Hackney and Stoke Newington. And what matters is how these shelters were used. Not once, not as an experiment, but again and again and again. People go down when they need protection. They wait while the bombing passes, and when it stops, they come back up. And this is the crucial behavioural point. Helsby doesn't describe a population disappearing underground. He describes people sheltering, then returning to work, sometimes even before the all clear. So Barcelona showed something very practical. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. Underground protection could be used repeatedly without stopping the life of the city. So the lesson was already there, not as hindsight, not as something discovered later. Bombing was being studied. Civilian vulnerability was being studied. And organised underground sheltering was being studied too. The question was what Britain chose to do with that knowledge. And Britain's own wartime infrastructure shows the same thing. Depth was not impossible. Britain did use it, but selectively, not everywhere, not equally, and not usually for ordinary streets. But where depth mattered to the state, it found ways to build it, adapt it, and occupy it. One of the clearest examples was out towards Ilford. Plessey was an engineering and electronics company making war equipment. Its production was taken underground. People went down there not to wait out a raid, but to work, and not just briefly. This was organised shift work, 24 hours a day. Machinery, ventilation, movement systems, all organised below the surface so production could continue. And close to the centre of power, the same logic appears in the Admiralty Citadel. Protective depth for command and war administration. So the question was not whether Britain could create protected depth. It could. The question was where and for whom. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question. Protection depth was not imaginary. Some versions were being planned, others were already being built or used, but not for everyone. And even the London Underground system was not simply offered up as shelter space. Officially, stations had to be kept for the railways, keep them moving. They were not supposed to become air raid shelters. So when people went down, they were not simply using available space. They were pushing against the official use of the city. And ordinary Londoners understood that. They did not wait for the argument to be settled in policy. They went underground anyway. They went into tube stations and onto platforms, spaces built for transport, not originally designed to become nightly dormitories, but were now being remade night after night into places of shelter. This is the public answer to the policy anxiety. When danger comes close, people do not only follow the intended use of a place, they read the city differently. And when the choice is between the surface and somewhere deeper, they go anyway. And once people were there, improvised sheltering became organised. Platforms became sleeping areas, movement space became shelter space. What had been resisted became part of the managed wartime city. But Stoke Newington had no tube at its centre. Manor House lay up to its northern edge, but there was no deep platform under Stoke Newington High Street, none under Church Street, and nothing in the south toward Newington Green. No ready-made underground system close enough for most people in the borough to use. So if deep protection was going to exist here, it would have to be planned, engineered, made. And this matters because by January 1939, London boroughs were already thinking this way. Underground car parks, bomb-proof shelters, reinforced concrete and steel, 60 feet down. This is not hindsight. It's pre-war planning. And Stoke Newington wasn't alone in asking this kind of question. In Finsbury, the borough of Finsbury, Tecton, led by Berthold Lubetkin with Ove Arup, were also developing shelter proposals that treated protection as civic infrastructure. Not just something attached to a house, but something planned, drawn, engineered, and built into the life of the borough. So the question becomes sharper. What happens when that kind of thinking is applied to Stoke Newington itself? Not as a general London problem, not as an abstract policy debate, but to what was then the borough of Stoke Newington, to its houses, its streets. By the end of March 1939, this was no longer just general discussion. Stoke Newington had engaged Dr. Oscar Faber to make a comprehensive survey of shelter provision in the borough. His task was not simply to rubber stamp an underground scheme, but to consider what kind of protection would work best. His report is dated the 5th of April, 1939. So the focus is Stoke Newington, because by April 1939, this specific borough had something very different in front of it. A detailed engineering report, marked private and confidential, not for publication. Prepared by Dr. Oscar Faber, working with the borough engineer, John Lamond. Not a vague idea, not a pressure group pamphlet, a serious proposal for how Stoke Newington could be protected. And this matters because the Stoke Newington scheme was not a speculative exercise. It involved serious professional expertise. Dr. Oscar Faber was one of Britain's leading structural engineers, a reinforced concrete specialist and former president of the Institution of Structural Engineers. And he was working in collaboration with John Lamond, Stoke Newington's own borough engineer and surveyor. So this was not fantasy. It was expert engineering applied to a real borough. And when that expertise is turned into a scheme, this is what it produces. Or rather, this is my reconstruction of what it produces. The original Faber plans have not yet been located. So this map has been rebuilt from the dimensions, route descriptions, and figures in the surviving report. And even with that caution, the scale of the proposal is clear. Not a single shelter, not a few isolated refuges, a system running beneath the borough, following the streets people used, and placing entrances close enough for people to reach them in time. The logic is simple, but extremely powerful. Protection has to be reachable. And physically, this is the idea. Not a basement, not a shallow trench, around 60 feet down in London clay. In section, the idea was 2 parallel tunnels to be linked by cross passages, large enough to shelter people below the ordinary surface of the borough. So the scheme is spatial, but it's also geological. The numbers are important too, because they show that this was not just a dramatic idea, it was calculated. Faber sets out 25,400 feet of tunnel, entrances at intervals of about 225 feet. The aim was that people would generally be within 500 feet of a way down. And the tunnels themselves were designed to accommodate over 50,000 people. This is the core part of the Stoke Newington system. Across the wider system, the figure rises to 59,200, including 6,000 from Hackney along the High Street. And that reachability matters. These figures are not just engineering figures. They describe how quickly people could move from the ordinary surface of the borough into protection. Because entrances are spaced every 225 feet, generally within 500 feet of a way down, roughly 2 minutes from an entrance into the system. So shelter is not imagined as distant, exceptional, or concentrated in a few large sites. It's distributed through the street system itself. Protection had to be close enough to use. And this is important. Faber is not just proposing empty tunnels. Each section is designed to work as a managed environment. Ventilation, gas protection, sanitation, first aid rooms, report centres, wardens and emergency squads. So this is not simply space underground. It's a functioning civic system beneath the borough. And Faber's thinking is wider than the tunnel network alone. He also includes a bomb-resisting car park shelter at Manor House, useful in peacetime as a car park and in war as protection for around 2,200 people. The main deep shelter system itself was estimated to take around just 6 months to build. He also sets out a cheaper, faster alternative scheme, and it shows he had weighed other options, not simply assumed the deepest scheme from the start. But the key point is that he doesn't treat the alternative as equal. He is clear that it gives much less protection, especially in the most crowded parts of the borough. And Faber knows this is going to be an expensive scheme. He says so. His estimated cost is £559,800. In 1939, that's a very large public expenditure. So cost is not being brushed aside, it becomes part of the argument. Faber then changes the scale of the calculation. Instead of asking only, what does the whole scheme cost? He divides the cost by the number of people protected. £559,800 divided across 59,200 people. That brings it down to under £10 per person, roughly £9.10 shillings. That is the significance. The huge headline cost becomes a calculation of protection per person. And this is where Faber's argument becomes more technical. He's not saying the scheme is cheap. He's saying that the cost has to be measured against what and who is being protected. He's treating it almost like an insurance premium, not insurance on buildings, insurance on people. And Faber's point is also that society has already invested in them, in bringing them up, educating them, and making them part of the civic life of the country. So the question changes. Not just can the borough afford the scheme, but what does it mean to decide that protecting those lives costs too much? And this is where the calculation stops being abstract, because the question was never only what a tunnel system would cost, it was what exposure would cost if that system wasn't built. On the 13th of October 1940, Coronation Avenue in Stoke Newington was hit. Over 160 people died. It was one of the worst single high-explosive bomb incidents in London during the Blitz, and the defining catastrophe of Stoke Newington's war. Now, we cannot say simply that Faber's scheme would have prevented this, but we can say this is the kind of vulnerability his scheme was designed to answer. So why wasn't it built? Not because nobody had imagined it, not because no engineer had calculated it, and not because Stoke Newington had failed to ask the question, but because a scheme like this needed more than engineering. It needed approval, it needed funding, and it needed central government to accept deep civilian protection as legitimate public policy. Finsbury shows that pressure very clearly. On the 27th of March 1939, the Hackney Gazette reports delay on the part of the government in reaching a decision on Finsbury's own deep bomb-proof shelter scheme. Finsbury wanted to proceed. In this newspaper, in this newspaper report, the proposal was for 7,600 residents. It was even imagined as useful in peacetime as well as wartime. And this is why Finsbury belongs in this story too. A borough could commission a scheme, It could calculate it and it could argue for it. But to build something at this scale, it needed permission, funding, and national policy moving in the same direction. And this wasn't confined to Finsbury or Stoke Newington. As late as the 4th of August, 1939, barely a month before the war began, Hackney's council was reported as approving an extensive, deep shelter scheme. Provision for more than 92,000 people, reported as accessible to all within 2 minutes. Again, the issue was not only depth, it was reachability. But by the eve of war, boroughs were running out of time. And still, they needed national policy to move with them. But national policy was pointing elsewhere. The official system favoured dispersal. Domestic shelters, communal surface shelters, protection that kept people close to home, close to the surface, and close to work. Deep shelters raised a different kind of anxiety. Would people stay underground? Would work stop? Would the state create an expectation it did not want to meet? So Faber's scheme was not defeated by engineering. It was squeezed by policy, funding, timing, and fear of what deep protection might mean. And that distinction matters, because the question was not simply whether depth could be built. Britain did build depth for production, for command. Later, after the Blitz, London would even get dedicated deep-level shelters through the London Passenger Transport Board. But the question here is whether that logic would be extended in time to ordinary streets. In Stoke Newington, the answer was no. Protection is never only technical. It is administrative, it is political, but finally, it is moral. It is a choice. Thank you.